All right, folks, strap yourselves in for a deep dive into the heart of the European Union. We're talking about its role on the world stage
Yeah.
and, all the challenges it's grappling with. This one's especially key for our UPSC aspirants, especially those of you focusing on international relations.
It really is a crucial area to understand, even for, the general public. The EU might seem like a world away, but trust me, its decisions and its struggles, they have ripple effects that reach us all.
Exactly. And the source material we've got today really digs deep into this whole question of, can the EU, with all its different member states, actually speak with a united voice globally?
Yeah, it's a fascinating paradox. On one hand, you have this economic powerhouse, a major player in global trade and diplomacy. But then when it comes to foreign policy, it often seems to stumble.
So let's rewind a bit. I mean, the EU's journey towards a unified foreign policy, it hasn't exactly been a walk in the park, right? Our source material points to the Treaty of Rome as the starting point, laying the foundation for the EU. But its focus was almost entirely on economic integration. Foreign policy, not so much.
Exactly. Back then, the priority was to rebuild Europe after World War II. I mean, you can understand it. Economic cooperation was the key, the glue to bind nations together and prevent future conflicts.
Makes sense. But then comes the Maastricht Treaty in the 1990s. That's when they introduced the Common Foreign and Security Policy, the CFSP. This felt like a big shift, a signal that the EU was ready to step onto the world stage, not just economically, but also politically.
It was a pivotal moment, no doubt. Creating the CFSP and the position of the High Representative for Foreign Affairs showed their ambition. Remember Javier Solana, the former NATO Secretary General, taking on that role? That's a strong message.
Definitely a power move.
Yeah.
So with the CFSP in place, did the EU finally start flexing its diplomatic muscles? Was it racking up wins on the world stage?
Well, the CFSP definitely had its successes. Think about it. The EU deployed peacekeeping missions to some of the world's most volatile regions. We're talking Bosnia, Chad, even Indonesia. These missions often worked with the UN, helping destabilize conflict zones and prevent humanitarian disasters.
So they weren't all talk. They were putting boots on the ground and making a real difference.
Exactly. And don't forget the diplomatic successes. Remember the E3's involvement in the Iran nuclear negotiations. The UK, France, and Germany, they played a key role in trying to get Iran to curb its nuclear program. It showed the EU's potential as a diplomatic force in complex negotiations.
So if things were going so well, why didn't the CFSP turn the EU into a foreign policy superpower? Our source material mentions some pretty serious limitations.
The reality is the CFSP had its downsides. For one, the EU lacked a strong, unified military force. It had to rely on NATO, especially during key moments like the Kosovo crisis. This really highlighted the limits of its ability to act on its own.
So despite the ambitions of the CFSP, they still had to depend on the US-led NATO when things got tough. That must have been a blow to those pushing for a more independent European defense.
For sure. And then there were the internal divisions. Remember the debate over recognizing Kosovo's independence? It showed deep cracks within the EU. Some member states recognized Kosovo while others refused.
And it wasn't just Kosovo, right? The source material also mentions Slovenia blocking Croatia's EU accession talks because of a border dispute, and Greece making things difficult for Macedonia due to that name issue. These internal squabbles must have made it tough for the EU to present a united front globally.
Absolutely. These seemingly small disputes really did damage. They undermined the EU's credibility and effectiveness in foreign policy.
It's like trying to get 27 different musicians to play the same tune in perfect harmony. Not an easy feat. But the challenges don't end there, do they? Our source material also talks about the whole issue of EU enlargement and the economic hurdles the bloc has had to deal with.
You're absolutely right. Enlargement, while it's expanded the EU's influence, has also made things a lot more complicated.
Yeah, it makes you wonder. The early days of European integration with the original 6 members, it seemed like they had this real sense of shared purpose.
Absolutely. Their success came from that strong sense of unity, that commitment to the core ideals of Europe. Remember the historical context, the devastation of World War II, the desire for peace and stability. These things were powerful motivators.
It's amazing how shared experiences like that can bring people together. But as the EU grew, welcoming new members with their own histories and goals, that unity must have been harder to maintain.
Exactly. Each wave of enlargement, like when the UK and Denmark joined, or the Southern European countries, brought in more diversity. And with diversity comes, a potential weakening of that initial commitment to the European project.
It's like adding too many ingredients to a dish, right? Sometimes it works, sometimes it just becomes a bit of a mess.
That's a great analogy. And this challenge became even more pronounced with the eastward expansion in the early 2000s, welcoming countries like Poland, Hungary, the Czech Republic. It was historic, a win for democracy, but it also changed things.
Yeah, I can see that. Suddenly, you have all these former communist nations, each with their own experiences and concerns, joining a bloc shaped by Western European values. It must have been tricky.
Very tricky. This eastward expansion tipped the balance. It made consensus and decision-making in the EU much tougher. It raised questions about the EU's identity and its ability to function with such a wide range of priorities.
Almost like the EU had an identity crisis. And this leads to something mentioned in our source material, multi-speed Europe. What does that even mean?
Well, it acknowledges that maybe not all EU countries want to integrate at the same pace. It suggests a future where different groups within the EU might move forward at different speeds, depending on their level of commitment, politically, economically, or socially.
So instead of forcing everyone to move at the same speed, this would let some countries sprint ahead while others take their time.
You could say that. It could address some of the challenges of diversity, but it also has risks. It might create divisions within the bloc, which would undermine the whole idea of European unity.
It's a tough situation. On one hand, you have this push for more integration, but then you have the reality of different national interests and varying levels of enthusiasm for the European project.
And it gets even more complex when you add in the economic realities the EU has faced, especially the eurozone crisis.
Right, the eurozone crisis. That was a huge wake-up call. It exposed how vulnerable the single currency was and made people question the EU's economic model.
Definitely a defining moment. It showed deep flaws and a lack of political will to fix them.
Our source material points out that while the EU's had economic success, its share of global trade and production has been going down. And some people say those social protections and welfare provisions that Europeans value are actually making them less competitive globally.
It's a complicated issue. Those social protections are seen as essential to the European way of life, ensuring a good standard of living. But they do come with a cost, and it's impacting their competitiveness.
And then you have the eurozone crisis hitting in the late 2000s. Countries like Greece, Spain, Portugal, Ireland, Italy, all dealing with huge deficits and needing bailouts. It felt like the whole thing was about to fall apart.
Turbulent times, for sure. The Eurozone crisis didn't just expose weak economies. It showed a lack of solidarity and leadership within the EU. The German-led bailouts, while necessary, created resentment and division.
It's like when one sibling keeps having to bail out another, it creates tension in the family.
Exactly. The Eurozone crisis was a wake-up call. It showed they needed more fiscal discipline, better oversight, maybe even a rethink of how the Eurozone works.
And all of this affects the EU's global role, right?
Yeah.
Can a bloc struggling with its own economy and political divisions really project power and influence on the world stage?
That's the big question. The Eurozone crisis definitely hurt the EU's image and made people doubt its ability to act as one. But it also showed the EU's resilience and ability to adapt.
So it's still up in the air whether the EU can overcome these challenges and become a stronger, more unified global player.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. The EU's quest for unified foreign policy, the whole enlargement issue, and those economic storms they've had to weather. But for our UPSC aspirants, those focusing on international relations, the big question is, what does this all mean for India?
That's the crucial part, right? Understanding how the EU works internally is essential for India if they want to engage effectively with this bloc. I mean, the EU is a major economic partner for India, a big player in global trade, and they have a strong voice on things like climate change and sustainable development.
It's almost like trying to solve this intricate puzzle, figuring out where India fits in this constantly changing picture of the EU.
Exactly. And the puzzle pieces keep moving. The EU's internal divisions, its economic problems, its relationship with NATO, they all affect India's foreign policy choices.
Our source material doesn't specifically talk about the India-EU relationship, but it does lay the groundwork for understanding the complexities India has to navigate. Absolutely. So what are the key takeaways? Well, first, the EU's struggle for a unified foreign policy means India needs to engage with both the EU as a whole and with individual member states. Building strong ties with countries like France and Germany is important, but so is understanding the views of newer members like Poland and Hungary.
So it's not just about dealing with Brussels, it's about knowing each member state's priorities and concerns. Seems like a lot of diplomatic juggling.
It is. And second, the EU's economic challenges present both opportunities and risks for India. The EU's search for new markets could benefit India's economy, but their economic woes could also lead to protectionist measures that might harm Indian exports.
It's about finding that balance, right? Capitalizing on the good stuff while minimizing the risks.
Exactly. And third, how the EU's security posture is evolving is important for India's own strategic planning. The EU's focus on defense cooperation and its ties with NATO, India needs to consider all of this for their own security policy.
So it's a multifaceted relationship, always evolving, with economic, political, and security dimensions. Sounds like our UPSC aspirants have a lot to think about.
It's a complex landscape for sure, but that's what makes it so fascinating and so crucial for anyone who wants to understand how international relations work in the 21st century.
Hopefully, this deep dive has given our UPSC aspirants a good starting point. Dig deeper into specific areas, like the India-EU strategic partnership trade relations, or how they're cooperating on climate change. The more you understand the EU's internal dynamics, the better you'll be at analyzing its role in the world and how it impacts India's foreign policy.
And for everyone listening, whether you're studying for exams or just curious about the world, we hope this deep dive has made you more interested in the European Union. It's a story that's still unfolding, full of challenges and opportunities, and it's a story that's deeply connected to India's own journey in the 21st century.
And that brings us to the end of our deep dive. Hope you found it insightful. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this with your friends. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep those brains buzzing.